There was a letter, and the letter was the whole problem. It had been written some years earlier by a man who had every reason to believe he would go on living, and it said, in effect, that when his time came, the woman who received it was to be sent for. He signed it, she kept it. For a decade she carried the knowledge of that letter the way other women carried a house key, and for a decade it did not matter, because he was thick-set and rude and enormously alive, and he ate like a man settling a score with his own arteries. Then on the 6th of May 1910, it mattered very much. King Edward VII was dying in Buckingham Palace of bronchitis and a lifetime of cigars, and Alice Keppel arrived at the palace with that letter in her possession, and she presented it, and the machinery of the British court had to decide what to do about a piece of paper signed by a king who could no longer explain himself. Queen Alexandra sent for her. That is the part people find hardest to believe, and it is the part that is best attested. The wife of the dying king summoned her husband's mistress into the room where he was dying, shook her hand, said something correct and cool, and then moved away to the window and left them to it. Alexandra had been deaf for years by then, and had spent 4 decades being publicly humiliated by a husband whose appetites were a matter of continental gossip, and on the last afternoon of his life, she made a decision that no biographer has ever fully explained. She let the woman in. What happened next did not go well. Alice Keppel, who had built an entire career on never once losing control of a room, lost control of the room. The king was barely conscious and did not appear to recognize her. She became distressed. She said, according to more than one account written down afterwards by people who were in the palace that day, that she would never be spoken to again, that she would be cut off, that everything was finished. She had to be taken out. Sir Frederick Ponsonby, who was the assistant private secretary, and who wrote about it later, described the scene in terms that were not kind. She was removed to another room, and she was, the phrase used at the time, in hysterics. And that is the last moment in the entire life of Alice Keppel where she failed to manage the situation. It is also, not coincidentally, the moment the erasure begins. Because here is what happened to that letter, and to the woman, and to the 12 years of her life that preceded that afternoon. Almost nothing. She was not at the funeral in any capacity that the record acknowledges. She was not mentioned in the official biography of the king, which was written by Sir Sidney Lee, and which handled the entire subject of Edward VII's private life, the way a butler handles a stain, by moving a piece of furniture over it. She left England within weeks. She burned paper. Other people burned paper on her behalf. The Royal Archives at Windsor, which hold a great deal, do not hold her. And within 1 generation, the name Keppel had been so thoroughly detached from the throne that when it came back, more than 80 years later, in a tabloid newsroom in London, most of the country heard it as a piece of trivia rather than as a return. Now hold that image, because there is a second one, and the distance between them is the reason we are here. On the 9th of April 2005, at the Guildhall in Windsor, a woman named Camilla Rosemary Parker Bowles married the heir to the British throne in a civil ceremony that the Queen did not attend. The bride was the daughter of Rosalind Shand. Rosalind Shand was the daughter of Sonia Cubitt. Sonia Cubitt was the second daughter of Alice Keppel. 4 generations, 2 women. The same family, the same country, the same institution, and the same essential arrangement, which is that a married man in the direct line of succession conducted a long and open relationship with a married woman, while the machinery of the palace looked at the ceiling and thought about something else. One of those women was erased so successfully that her own great-granddaughter grew up in a house where the subject was handled with tongs. The other became queen. The obvious way to tell this story is as a piece of ancestral irony, the sort of thing that gets a knowing paragraph in a Sunday supplement. The family curse, the blood will out, the great-granddaughter repeating the great-grandmother. That version is available everywhere, and it is worth almost nothing, because it explains a coincidence by pointing at it. What it cannot tell you is why the first arrangement worked for 12 years without ever seriously threatening the crown, and why the second one nearly took the monarchy apart in the early 1990s and required a decade of public relations work and 1 funeral to recover from. The answer lies in the conditions rather than the blood, and the conditions are what got erased, and they are what we are going to reconstruct over the next 2.5 hours. Let me tell you what Alice Keppel actually was, because the word mistress does about 10% of the work here, and misleads you on the other 90. She was born Alice Frederica Edmonstone on the 29th of April 1868, the ninth and youngest child of Admiral Sir William Edmonstone, 4th Baronet, of Duntreth Castle in Stirlingshire. 9 children. Consider what that does to a household budget and to a youngest daughter's understanding of how attention is allocated. The Edmonstones were old, Scottish, respectable, and not remotely rich in the way that mattered in London. Duntreth was a castle in the sense that it had towers and a history, and a liability in the sense that it had a roof. Alice grew up in a family where the name was excellent and the money was thin, which is the precise combination that produces a certain kind of woman, one who understands from childhood that charm is not a decoration, but an income. In 1891, at 22, she married the Honourable George Keppel, 3rd son of the 7th Earl of Albemarle. 3rd son. In the English aristocratic system of the period, a 3rd son inherited the accent, the connections, and the club membership, and very little else. George was tall, handsome, amiable, monumentally unequipped to earn a living, and by every account that survives, a genuinely decent man. They had almost no money. They had a great deal of access. They were exactly the sort of couple who could be invited anywhere and afford nothing. Violet was born in 1894, and in February of 1898, at a house in London, Alice Keppel was introduced to Albert Edward, Prince of Wales. She was 29, he was 56. Now, the Prince of Wales in 1898 was a man with a long and well-documented history in this area. Lily Langtry had come and gone. Daisy Greville, Countess of Warwick, had been the reigning favourite for the better part of a decade and had made herself exhausting because Daisy talked. Daisy wrote letters. Daisy would later attempt something close to blackmail. The prince was 56 years old, 3 years from a throne he had been waiting for since he was a boy, and he was tired of women who created weather. Alice Keppel created no weather at all. That was the entire product. Within a year she had displaced Daisy Warwick completely, and she held the position, without interruption, without scandal, without a single serious wobble, for the remaining 12 years of his life. She is the only one of them who lasted. She is the only one who was still there at the end. And she managed it while remaining married to George Keppel, who continued to appear at the same dinners, in the same houses, in the same photographs, being pleasant to everybody, in what has to be one of the more remarkable sustained performances in modern English social history. The arrangement was open, and this is the thing that gets lost. Forget coded letters and rented rooms. She was received. She was seated near him at dinner. She travelled to Biarritz in the spring when he went, staying at the Hotel du Palais with George sometimes present and sometimes not. She was at Sandringham. Country house hostesses across England knew that if you invited the king, you invited Mrs. Keppel, and the housekeeper knew which 2 bedrooms to prepare and how far apart to put them, and nobody wrote a word about it in a newspaper, because in Edwardian England the press did not do that, and because everyone involved had agreed, without ever discussing it, on the terms. Those terms are the thing that was erased, and they are more interesting than the affair. Begin with the discretion, which was professional in its rigour. In 12 years, she never gave an interview, never published a line, never leaked, never boasted, never once traded on the relationship in a way that could be seen. When she died in 1947, she had said nothing publicly about him for 37 years. Compare that to almost any other figure in the same position in any century, and the discipline is extraordinary. Then there was her usefulness. This is the part that has been most thoroughly buried, and it is the part that matters most. Alice Keppel was politically literate. She read the papers. She understood the ministries. She knew who was rising and who was finished. Ministers used her, and they used her seriously. If you needed the king in a receptive mood on a difficult subject, you went to Mrs. Keppel first, and you found out what the weather was in that house. The Liberal government of 1906, which the king distrusted, found her useful in exactly this way. She was a channel. Sir Charles Hardinge of the Foreign Office said as much and put it in writing, and what he said, in substance, was that she never used the position for harm, and that on several occasions she used it for good, and that he wanted this on the record because he expected it to be left out. He was right. It was left out. Money is the third of them, and here the story gets less comfortable. Alice Keppel did not remain poor. The Keppels moved to Portman Square. They employed staff. They educated 2 daughters expensively, and George Keppel's earnings do not begin to explain any of it. What explains it is Sir Ernest Cassel, the German-born financier, who was the king's private money manager and one of the richest men in England. Cassel handled Alice Keppel's investments. He put her into things. He put her into them on terms that were, to put it at its most neutral, advantageous. She came out of the Edwardian decade a wealthy woman, and she stayed wealthy through the Great War, through the collapse of 1929, and through the 1930s, which tells you the money was managed by someone who knew what he was doing. You will find, in the more excitable accounts, a specific figure attached to what she was worth, and a specific figure attached to what she was given. I am not going to give you either, because when you follow those figures back they dissolve. They come from books that cite an unnamed source. What is solid is the relationship with Cassel, the standard of living, and the fact that nobody in the family ever had to work again for 2 generations. That is enough. That is more than enough. So you have a woman who is discreet, politically useful, financially provided for by the king's own banker, married to a man who has agreed to the arrangement, operating in a society that has agreed not to write it down. Every adult in that structure consented. That is the load-bearing fact of the entire first half of this story, and if you take it away, the structure falls, which is exactly what happened 70 years later to her great-granddaughter. Before I go on, let me say the thing I have to say, and then we will get back to 1910. If you are watching this, and you are finding it worth your time, subscribe to the channel. That is the whole request. It costs nothing, it takes 1 second, and it is the only thing that determines whether these get made. This one took a long time to research, and the research is the expensive part, because there is a version of this story that you can write in an afternoon, out of tabloid clippings, and there is a version that requires reading Sir Frederick Ponsonby, and Sir Charles Hardinge, and Diana Suhami, and Jane Ridley, and Osbert Sitwell, and then throwing out about half of what is in them. Subscribing tells the algorithm that people want the second version. Do that now and then let us get on with it. Right, 1910. The king dies on the 6th of May. The scene at the palace happens. Alice Keppel is removed from the room and taken to another part of the building, and at that moment her entire position in England evaporates. Because her position had always been personal rather than institutional, it existed inside one man's regard, and it ended when he stopped breathing. The new king was George V. George V was his father's son, in exactly no respects that are relevant here. He was rigid, moral, domestic, obsessed with punctuality and stamp collecting, and he regarded his father's private arrangements with something close to disgust. Queen Mary shared the view without the softening effect of having actually liked anybody involved. The court that took over Buckingham Palace in May of 1910 was a court that intended to be different, and being different meant, among other things, that Mrs. Keppel was over. She understood this within days. That is the mark of her, the thing that separates her from Daisy Warwick, and from everybody else who has ever held that position. She did not fight. No letters went out to anyone who might have intervened, and no approach was made to the newspapers, though in 1910 there were papers that would have paid her a fortune for 20 minutes of her time. Nobody was threatened with publication. Nobody was even allowed to suspect that publication had crossed her mind. She left the country. The Keppels went abroad in the autumn of 1910, and they stayed away for 2 years. Ceylon, China, the Far East, on a long, slow, expensive circuit of the sort that Edwardian people undertook when it had been suggested to them that England would be improved by their absence. She took her daughters, she took George, and she came back in 1912 to a London that had, in the interval, been given time to forget where to put her. That 2-year absence was the most competent thing she ever did. She removed herself from the scene at precisely the moment when remaining in it would have forced everyone to have an opinion about her, and she returned after the question had gone stale. By 1912 she was simply Mrs. Keppel of Grosvenor Street, a rich and charming woman with excellent connections and a slightly interesting past, and London, which loves nothing more than an accommodation, accommodated her. And the burning had already started. Letters were destroyed, hers to him, his to her. The exact scale of it is unknowable by definition, which is the point of burning things, but the outline is visible from the shape of the whole. Edward VII's papers were substantially culled after his death, some of it on the instruction of Queen Alexandra, some of it by his private secretaries acting on what they understood to be the family's wishes. Alice Keppel destroyed her own side. She had a lifetime to do it, and she used the lifetime. When Sir Sidney Lee produced the official biography, the woman who had been at the center of the king's private life for 12 years appears in it barely at all, and where she does appear, the treatment is so bloodless that a reader could pass over her without noticing anything had been withheld. This is the thing I want you to hold on to for the next 2 hours, because it is the actual argument of this video, and it will probably surprise you. What got erased was not the scandal. The scandal, such as it was, survived perfectly well. Everybody in London society knew about Alice Keppel and Edward VII in 1910, and everybody in London society still knew about it in 1950. It was in the memoirs. Osbert Sitwell wrote about her with enormous affection and no discretion whatsoever. Vita Sackville West's circle knew. The gossip never went anywhere, because gossip does not need archives. What got erased was the competence. The record of a woman who was consulted by ministers, who was trusted by the Foreign Office, who managed a king's temper as a matter of routine national convenience, who ran a political salon in all but name, and who conducted the single longest and most stable relationship of that kind in modern British royal history, without ever once causing the institution a problem. All of that went, and what was left behind, once you strip out the substance, is a shape with no content in it, a pretty woman in Edwardian dress, standing near a fat king, available to be used as a punchline by anyone who needed one. Which is precisely what happened 83 years later, in January of 1993. Because the reason you know the name Keppel at all, the reason this connection is common knowledge, rather than a footnote in a specialist biography, has nothing to do with a historian. No academic recovered Alice Keppel. What happened was a circulation war between British tabloid newspapers and a recorded telephone conversation between the Prince of Wales and Camilla Parker Bowles, and an editorial decision that the ancestral link made excellent copy. The great-grandmother came back into public consciousness as a piece of ammunition in somebody else's fight. She was disinterred to make a point about her great-granddaughter, and the point that was made was the crude one. Like great-grandmother, like great-granddaughter. It runs in the family. The Keppel women have always been like this. That framing was in the papers within days, and it stuck for the better part of a decade, and it is still the frame that most people carry, and it is close to the exact opposite of what the evidence supports. Here is why, and then we will go back to the beginning and do this properly. The arrangement that Alice Keppel operated inside worked because of 4 conditions, and every single one of them was gone by 1980. There was a press that did not print it. The wife had accepted it, publicly and privately, for reasons of her own that she took to the grave. Her husband stayed in the house and never once complained on the record. And the whole thing sat inside a society of perhaps a few thousand people who all knew and who all understood that saying so out loud would cost them more than silence ever would. By the time Camilla Shand met Charles at a polo ground in Windsor Great Park in the early 1970s, the first of those was gone, and gone violently. An accepting wife was never going to exist, because the wife in question was 19 years old when she was engaged, and had not agreed to anything. The complaisant husband collapsed, and the small society of people who could keep a secret had become a country with a camera. Take away all 4 conditions, run the same arrangement, and you do not get 12 years of stability and a discreet exit. You get 1992. Now, there is a story you have probably heard about how the two of them met. It goes that Camilla walked up to Charles at a polo match and said, "My great-grandmother was your great-great-grandfather's mistress. How about it?" It is a wonderful line. It appears in a great many books. It is repeated as fact on television and in print with enormous confidence. It is also, on the evidence, almost certainly not what happened, and I am going to spend a proper amount of time on that in the second hour, because the way that line got invented and then hardened into history is itself a small model of the entire problem with this subject. There is a competing account from Lucia Santa Cruz, who actually introduced them and who is on the record about it, and her version is duller and more plausible, and involves a remark about genes made by a third party. The duller version has the disadvantage of not being a great line. That is the pattern with Alice Keppel from start to finish. The vivid version drives out the accurate one, and then the vivid version becomes the only version, and then somebody's great-granddaughter has to live inside it. So over the next 2.5 hours, this is where we are going. First, back to Dundreath, to a household with 9 children and a leaking roof, to work out where the skill came from. Then George Keppel, properly and at length, because he is the least examined and most interesting man in this entire story, a person who made a decision in 1898 and stuck to it for 50 years without ever complaining about it, in a form that survives. The money comes after that, and Ernest Cassell with it, and the question of what it means when a king's banker handles your portfolio. Then the politics, Hardinge, the Foreign Office, the budget crisis of 1909, and what a woman holding no official position of any kind was doing in the middle of a constitutional emergency. Then we are going to look at what it cost, and it cost a great deal, and it was mostly paid by other people. Violet Keppel, the elder daughter, grew up watching her mother conduct a public-private life with total impunity, drew the obvious conclusion about what was permitted, and then discovered in the most brutal way available that the permission had never been transferable. What happened to Violet and Vita Sackville West in 1919 and 1920 is one of the most extraordinary sequences in 20th century English social history, and Alice Keppel's role in ending it tells you more about her than the entire Edwardian decade does. Then Sonia, the younger daughter, who was born in 1900, who took the opposite lesson from her sister, who married Roland Cubitt, and became conventional, with a determination that reads as a lifelong argument with her own mother, and whose daughter Rosalind married an army officer called Bruce Shand, and whose granddaughter is the Queen. After that, Florence and the Villa dell'Ombrellino on the hill at Bellosguardo, where the Keppels spent the last 20 years of their lives entertaining, and where Alice Keppel became the last surviving witness to a world that had ended, and where she stayed until Mussolini made it impossible, and where she went back the moment the war was over. And it ends where all of this ends, in September of 1947, with 2 deaths 8 weeks apart. And then we are going to run the whole thing forward, through 4 generations of women who could not or would not speak about it, until we arrive at a wedding in Windsor in 2005 and a coronation in 2023, and ask the only question worth asking, which is what it takes to erase a person and what it takes for the erasure to fail. The letter, incidentally, was never seen again. Whatever Alice Keppel brought into Buckingham Palace on the 6th of May 1910, and whatever it said, and whoever read it, it is not in the archive, and it has never been produced. Sir Frederick Ponsonby, who saw the aftermath and wrote about it, does not tell us what became of it. That is a small thing. It is also the whole method in miniature. A document existed, a great many people knew it existed, it was inconvenient, and then it stopped existing, and nobody had to give an order. Let us go back to 1868. Dundreath Castle sits in the Blaine Valley in Stirlingshire, about 12 miles north of Glasgow, in a stretch of country that is beautiful, in the specific Scottish way that also means wet. The Edmonstones had held it since the 14th century. There is a charter, there is a descent from a daughter of Robert III, and there is the sort of family history that gets recited at dinner by an uncle who has had enough claret to think you are interested. What there was not, in any quantity that would have impressed a London banker, was money. This is the first thing to understand about the household Alice Frederica Edmonstone was born into, on the 29th of April, 1868. The Edmonstones were unimpeachable. Admiral Sir William Edmonstone, 4th Baronet, had a naval career, a title that went back to the 17th century, and a wife, Mary Elizabeth Parsons, who was the daughter of an Irish clergyman with connections of his own. They were exactly the class of people who could not be looked down on by anybody, and could not afford to compete with anybody either. And there were 9 children. Sit with that number for a moment, because it does more work in this story than any other single fact about her childhood. 9 children in a Victorian gentry family meant a household organized around scarcity that nobody was permitted to call scarcity. The eldest son gets the estate. The other sons get commissions, livings, colonial appointments, whatever can be arranged through the network. And the daughters get whatever is left of the attention and whatever can be scraped together as a settlement, which in a family of this size and this income was not going to be much. Alice was the youngest of the 9, the very last. By the time she was old enough to notice how the house worked, The pattern had been set 8 times over, and what she would have noticed is that in a room containing that many siblings, the child who gets what she wants is the one who can read the room fastest. Her father had spent money restoring Duntreth in the 1860s and 70s, which is what men of that class did when they came into a property that had been let go, and it is a habit that improves the view and destroys the balance sheet. The family kept the castle and kept up appearances and lived, like a very large number of Scottish landed families in the last third of the 19th century, in a permanent condition of visible respectability and invisible arithmetic. A girl growing up in that house learns 2 things very early. She learns that the family name will open any door in Britain, and she learns that it will not pay for anything once she is through it. Charm, in that situation, functions as working capital. By her late teens, Alice Edmonstone had a great deal of it. The descriptions of her are consistent across 40 years and across people who had no reason to agree with each other. Chestnut hair, very large blue eyes, which several people describe as turquoise, a figure that was fashionable in the 1890s in a way that has not been fashionable since, generous and corseted and emphatic, and the voice, which comes up again and again, low and husky and slightly amused, the kind of voice that makes people lean in without noticing that they have leaned in. Osbert Sitwell knew her for decades and wrote about her with real affection, and what he keeps returning to is the quality of her attention rather than the beauty. She looked at whoever was speaking as though nothing in the room was more interesting, and she remembered what they had said, and she brought it up the next time. That is a skill. It can be learned, and it is exhausting to sustain, and almost nobody sustains it for 50 years. She was also, by every account, funny. Not witty in the epigram-producing sense that Edwardian memoirists love to record, but funny in the room, in the moment, with timing. The wit that survives in print from that period tends to be the polished kind, and Alice Keppel produced very little of it, which is one of the reasons she is so hard to recover. The people who were there kept saying she was marvelous company, and then failing to write down anything she said. That is what conversational charm looks like 100 years later. A hole in the record, shaped like a person everybody liked. In 1891, at 22, she married. The Honourable George Keppel was 26, 6 feet 4 inches tall, extremely good-looking in the moustached Edwardian manner, and the 3rd son of the 7th Earl of Albemarle. The Keppels were Dutch in origin, having come over with William of Orange, and they had been embedded in the English aristocracy for 2 centuries. Arnold Joost van Keppel had been William's favourite, and was made 1st Earl of Albemarle for it, which is a piece of family history that acquires a certain flavour in retrospect. George was a 3rd son, and the English system was brutally clear about what that meant. The estate went to the eldest, the title went to the eldest. What George inherited was the name, the accent, the schooling, the clubs, and the absolute expectation that he would maintain a gentleman's standard of living on an income that could not possibly support it. He went into the army, the Gordon Highlanders, which was respectable and expensive, and being an officer in a Highland regiment in the 1890s cost considerably more than it paid. So here is the marriage, viewed coldly. A girl from an old Scottish family with no money marries a boy from an old English family with no money. Both of them are ornamental, well-connected, socially fluent, and completely unequipped to generate income. They are welcome at every good house in England, and they cannot afford to run one. It should have been a disaster, and for a few years it very nearly was. They lived modestly by the standards of their circle, which still meant servants, because there was no version of their life that did not include servants. George left the army. He worked, in a manner of speaking, for Sir Thomas Lipton, the grocery magnate, in a position that was less a job than an arrangement between a rich man who wanted access and a well-born man who needed a salary. Money came in and went straight out again. And Violet was born on the 6th of June, 1894. Now I have to handle something carefully here, because it is repeated everywhere, and the evidence for it is thinner than the confidence with which it is stated. There is a long-standing claim that Violet Keppel was not George Keppel's daughter, and that her father was Ernest Becket, later the 2nd Baron Grimthorpe, a banker and Member of Parliament, with whom Alice is said to have had a relationship in the early 1890s. Violet herself came to believe it, or was encouraged to believe it, and referred to it in later life. Diana Suhami, who whose 1996 book on Alice and Violet is the most serious modern treatment of the two of them, takes the Beckett paternity seriously. Other writers state it flatly as fact. What actually exists is a family belief, a set of resemblances that people claim to see in photographs, and the daughter's own later conviction, formed at a distance of decades in a life that was not short of dramatic self-narration. There is no document. There is no contemporary admission. It may well be true, and I would not be surprised if it were true, and I am not going to tell you that it is true, because a family belief and a proof are different objects, and this entire story has suffered from people treating them as the same thing. What matters for our purposes is simpler and much better attested, which is that by the middle of the 1890s, Alice Keppel had already established the pattern that would define her life. She formed close relationships with wealthy and powerful men. Her husband knew. Her husband did not object. And the arrangement was conducted with enough discretion that no scandal ever attached to it. In a society that was ferociously alert to scandal and enjoyed nothing more than destroying a woman for exactly this. There is a word for what she was doing, and the word carries a moral charge, and I want to be careful about applying it, because the moral charge tends to make people stop thinking. Alice Keppel operated in a marriage market where a woman of her class had no legal capacity to earn, no property of her own worth speaking of, no vote, no profession available to her, and a husband whose income could not sustain the life that both their families expected them to lead. She had a set of skills. She used them. Whether that is contemptible or admirable is a question you are entitled to answer for yourself. But the answer has almost no bearing on the more interesting question, which is how she got so extraordinarily good at it. Then came February 1898. The details of the introduction have been told several ways, which is normal for events that only became significant afterwards. The version that recurs most often places it at a social gathering in London in that month, an evening party of the ordinary sort, at which Alice Keppel, 29 years old, was presented to Albert Edward, Prince of Wales, aged 56. By the following month she was established. To understand how remarkable the speed of that was, you need to understand the man, and specifically, you need to understand what he was tired of. Albert Edward had been Prince of Wales since he was 1 month old. In 1898, he had been waiting to be king for 56 years, which is not a wait so much as a condition. His mother, Victoria, had never given him a single serious responsibility, had never shown him a state paper if she could avoid it, and had made it silently clear for 4 decades that she blamed him for his father's death. He filled the time with food, shooting, racing, travel, cards, and women, and he did it on a scale that was already legendary while he was alive. There had been a great many. Lily Langtry in the early 1880s, who had gone on to become an actress and a public figure, and had used the association in exactly the way that a discreet association is not supposed to be used. Various others whose names surface for a season and vanish. And then, for something close to a decade, Frances Evelyn Greville, Countess of Warwick, known universally as Daisy. Daisy Warwick is the essential comparison, and everything Alice Keppel did makes sense against her. Daisy was beautiful, rich in her own right, married to a complaisant earl, and constitutionally incapable of leaving anything alone. She was nicknamed the Babbling Brook, from her first married name of Brooke, and the nickname was earned. She talked, she wrote letters, and she kept the ones she received. She staged scenes. She had, in 1891, generated the Beresford affair, a spectacular mess involving Lord Charles Beresford, an anonymous letter, an angry wife, a threatened public exposure, and the personal intervention of the Prince of Wales, which ended with the Prince and Beresford not speaking for years, and a great deal of dangerous paper in circulation. She also, in the 1890s, discovered socialism, which she embraced with the total commitment of a very rich woman who has found a new interest, and began delivering opinions about the condition of the working classes to a man whose position on the condition of the working classes was that he preferred not to hear about it at dinner. By 1897, the prince was 55, exhausted by her, and looking for an exit that would not detonate. Daisy's own account is that she withdrew voluntarily. The actual sequence suggests something more mutual and more relieved on his side. And then, months later, a woman appeared who was the precise inverse of everything that had made Daisy Warwick unbearable. Alice Keppel did not talk. She did not write letters that could be kept, and she did not keep the ones she received, or if she kept them she burned them later, which comes to the same thing. She did not stage scenes, in the 12 years of the relationship, with the single exception of the last afternoon of his life, which is why that afternoon is so shocking to read about. She had no political program she wished to impose on him. She had no ambition to be a public figure. She never sought a title, and she never got one, and there is no evidence she ever asked. And she was, by universal agreement, the best company in England. That last item is the product. Consider what the daily life of Edward VII actually consisted of, both before and after 1891. A man in that position spends his life among people who are performing for him. Every conversation he has is with someone who wants something, or who is terrified of saying the wrong thing, or who has prepared their remarks in advance. The great luxury unavailable to him, the one thing his position could not buy, was an hour in a room with somebody who was relaxed. Alice Keppel could produce that hour on demand. She teased him. She contradicted him, carefully and about small things. She could tell when he was about to lose his temper, which he did frequently and violently over trivia, and she could turn it before it landed. There is a much repeated observation from the period that she was the only person who could make the king laugh when he had decided to be furious, and while the specific anecdotes attached to it are mostly unverifiable, the pattern behind them is confirmed by too many independent witnesses to dismiss. She also played bridge extremely well, and she played it well enough to be an asset at the table, and badly enough, when it mattered, to let him win. Both halves of that sentence are documented in the memoirs of people who sat at those tables. So within a year of the introduction, Alice Keppel had a position with no name and no formal existence, which was nonetheless understood by every hostess, every private secretary, and every senior politician in the country. And George Keppel, who was 33 years old and 6'4", and had a young daughter and a wife and no money, made a decision. He accepted it. I want to slow down here, because George Keppel is treated in almost every account of this story as a piece of furniture, and he is nothing of the kind. He is the load-bearing element of the entire structure, and he sustained a performance for 50 years that nobody has ever adequately explained. He did not leave, and he did not object. There was no descent into drink, no shooting accident that everyone politely called an accident, no scene at a country house party, and all three of those were routes taken by other men in comparable situations. He stayed in the house. He appeared at the dinners. He was, according to everyone who met him across 5 decades, unfailingly pleasant, socially adept, entirely at ease, and apparently without resentment. He was also, and this is the part that gets missed, materially transformed by it. The Keppels moved from their modest circumstances to a house in Portman Square, then in due course to Grosvenor Street. The daughters were educated expensively. There was a French governess. There were the clothes, the entertaining, the travel, the servants, all of it running at a level that George Keppel's nominal earnings could not have covered in 10 years. So the cynical reading is available, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. George Keppel was bought, and he knew he was bought, and he took the money. Except the cynical reading has a problem, which is that it stops explaining anything after 1910. The king died, the money from that source stopped, the position evaporated, and George Keppel stayed married to Alice for another 37 years, travelled the world with her, moved to Italy with her, ran a house in Florence with her, and died 2 months after she did, which is the sort of thing that happens to people who have been genuinely attached to each other for a very long time. Whatever the arrangement was between those two, it outlasted every commercial reason for it by nearly 4 decades. That is not nothing. That may in fact be the most interesting unrecorded relationship in the whole affair, and it is unrecorded because both of them wanted it that way. Now, the mechanics. How this actually worked, day to day, in a country that had a monarchy, a state church, a rigid public morality and a press. The first mechanism was the country house weekend, which had been perfected in the previous 30 years into an instrument of astonishing precision. A hostess invited a party for Friday to Monday. The hostess assigned bedrooms. The bedroom plan was the entire technology. Names were written on cards and slotted into brass frames on the doors. partly so that guests could find their rooms, and partly so that guests could find other people's, and every experienced hostess in England understood that the placement of two particular names in relation to each other was a statement about what was permitted under her roof. If you invited the Prince of Wales, and later the King, you invited Mrs. Keppel. This was not a request. It was a condition, communicated in advance by the private secretary's office, in language of enormous blandness, and every hostess in the country knew how to read it. George Keppel was sometimes invited too, and when he came, and he was charming, and everyone behaved as though this were the most ordinary thing in the world, which by that point it was. The second mechanism was the press, and the press requires explanation, because the modern reader cannot easily imagine it. British newspapers in the Edwardian period knew everything. Fleet Street was small and well connected, and the editors dined with the same people the King dined with. They knew about Alice Keppel in 1899. They knew the whole of it, and they printed none of it, for a combination of reasons that included libel law of extraordinary severity, a proprietorial class that wanted knighthoods and invitations, a genuine and widely shared belief that the private life of the monarch was not the public's business, and the simple commercial fact that no newspaper wanted to be the first to break a taboo that would have made it a pariah among the people it depended on. No law prevented publication, and no injunction was ever sought. What existed instead was an understanding, and the understanding held for the entire reign, and its holding is the single most important structural fact in the first half of this story. The third mechanism was Alexandra, and Alexandra is the hardest of the four to explain, because she left almost nothing that tells us what she thought. Queen Alexandra, born a Danish princess, married to him since 1863, had spent 35 years by the time Alice Keppel arrived, watching her husband conduct himself in public with other women. She had endured the Mordaunt divorce case in 1870, in which he was called as a witness, then Langtry, then Daisy Warwick, the Beresford business, and the birthday party in 1891, at which she pointedly failed to appear. Through all of it she was going deaf from otosclerosis, which cut her off from exactly the drawing-room conversation where all of this was managed, and she had turned inward toward her children with an intensity that did lasting damage to at least one of them. What she did about Alice Keppel was tolerate her. Not warmly, and the evidence for anything like friendship is thin, but she received her. She permitted her presence. She travelled on the royal yacht, knowing that Mrs. Keppel would be at Biarritz, and on the last day of her husband's life, she sent for her. The most persuasive explanation, and it is an explanation rather than a documented statement, is that Alexandra could see the difference between Alice Keppel and everyone who had come before. Alice Keppel never sought to displace her. She never appeared in her place at a public function. She never briefed against her, never patronized her, never made her ridiculous. She kept her husband in a settled temper which had public consequences that a queen could appreciate, and she asked for nothing that belonged to Alexandra. There is a remark attributed to Alexandra, in various forms, along the lines that she preferred Mrs. Keppel to the alternatives, because at least Mrs. Keppel was pleasant to everybody. I cannot source it to a contemporary document, and I would not build an argument on it, but it is consistent with everything she actually did. And the fourth mechanism was the money, which brings us to Sir Ernest Cassel, and which is a subject substantial enough that it deserves its own hour. Sir Ernest Cassel was born in Cologne in 1852, the son of a small Jewish banker, and he arrived in England at 17 with almost nothing, and a facility for figures that turned out to be close to freakish. By his 40s, he was one of the richest men in Europe. He financed railways in America and Sweden. He financed the Aswan Dam in Egypt. He was involved in Turkish and Egyptian state loans. He was a founder of the National Bank of Egypt, and he had a hand in Vickers, the armaments firm, at the precise historical moment when armaments became the growth industry of the century. He also, from the 1890s, managed the private finances of the Prince of Wales. This is one of the more consequential relationships of the late Victorian period, and it is barely taught. Albert Edward, when Cassel got to him, was in the condition that heirs to thrones with no employment and expensive habits tend to be in, which is to say he was in debt and had been for years. Cassel took the problem over. Within a decade, the prince had money, and by the time he came to the throne in 1901, he had a great deal of it, and none of it had come from the civil list. The mechanism was simple and entirely legal, and would end several careers today. Castle invested on the prince's behalf without requiring the prince to put up capital. He carried the position. If it rose, the profit was the prince's. If it fell, Castle absorbed it. This was not a loan, and it was not a gift. In any sense a court of law would have recognized, and everybody involved understood exactly what it was. The two men became genuinely close. They looked alike, which amused both of them and the cartoonists. Castle was made a Privy Councillor, given the Grand Cross of the Royal Victorian Order, and installed at Brook House on Park Lane, a building of such assertive magnitude that London called it the Giant's Cake. His granddaughter Edwina would marry Louis Mountbatten, which is how the money from a Cologne counting house ends up inside the royal family 2 generations later, though that is a different story. And Ernest Castle handled the investments of Alice Keppel. The arrangement she had appears to have been the same one the king had, or close enough that the distinction does not matter. Castle bought on her behalf. She was not required to find the capital. She took the gains. She was in American railway stock, in rubber during the rubber boom, in the international loan business, in the industrial positions that Castle was building for himself, and she was in them on terms available to almost nobody in Britain, and to no woman in Britain who was not a duchess in her own right. She came out of the Edwardian decade rich, not comfortable, rich in a way that survived the death of her protector, the collapse of the pre-war world, the Great War, the crash of 1929, and the whole of the 1930s, and that was still funding a substantial villa outside Florence, with a staff and a garden and a stream of visitors in 1946. Money that lasts through all of that is not luck. It is competent management, sustained over decades, of a portfolio that was well constructed at the start. I said in the opening hour that I would not give you figures, and I want to explain why once, properly, and then leave it alone. There are numbers in circulation. You will find a specific sum said to have been settled on her, and a specific valuation of her estate, and specific annual amounts. Follow any of them back through the literature, and you arrive at a book from the 1970s, citing a book from the 1950s, citing somebody's recollection of a conversation. Probate figures exist for her estate, and they are a matter of record, but a probate figure in 1947 tells you what was in her name at death in England, which for a woman who had lived in Italy for 20 years and had almost certainly arranged matters in advance, is close to meaningless as a measure of what she actually had. What is solid is the relationship with Castle, the standard of living it produced, and the fact that neither of her daughters nor either of her sons-in-law ever needed to earn a living. That is the shape of the money, and the shape is what matters. Now the awkward part, which most accounts skip. The king's financial circle was substantially Jewish. Castle, Baron Maurice de Hirsch, the Rothschilds, Alfred Bate, the Sassoons. Edward VII was, by the standards of his class and his century, unusually free of the prejudice that surrounded him, and he kept these men close, and he was attacked for it continuously, in a register that was sometimes coded and frequently was not. The phrase used about him was that he had surrounded himself with foreigners and financiers. The Kaiser said things on the subject that do not improve with age. There was a strain of British opinion, running through the Boer War and into the Edwardian years, that regarded the whole arrangement as evidence of a court that had been captured by money. Alice Keppel sat inside that circle and was funded by it, and the criticism attached to her too, in exactly the same coded language, with the additional charge that she was a woman being paid. I raise it because the anti-Semitism of the period is part of why the record of Castle and Alice Keppel is so thin and so hostile where it exists at all, and because understanding that helps you read the sources. A great deal of what was written about her at the time was written by people who disapproved of the king's friends, for reasons that had nothing to do with Alice Keppel, and everything to do with where Ernest Castle's parents were born. Which brings us to the second half of what she was doing, and the half that got erased hardest. Sir Charles Hardinge was permanent Under-Secretary at the Foreign Office from 1906 to 1910, which made him the most senior professional diplomat in the British Empire. He was not a sentimental man, and he was not in the business of paying compliments to society women. He travelled with the king on state visits. He saw the working relationship at close range for 4 years. And at some point he wrote down, in substance, that Mrs. Keppel had access to a great many state papers, that she never in his knowledge repeated anything she saw, that she never used her influence for any personal or improper purpose, and that on a number of occasions she had been of real service to the government by putting a view to the king that the government could not put to him directly. Read that again slowly. Because of the 4 sentences in it, 3 are about restraint. She saw state papers. This is the fact that gets lost under the word mistress. The king worked from red boxes wherever he was, at Sandringham, at country houses, at Biarritz, and Alice Keppel was in the room. Whether he showed her things deliberately, or she simply had the run of a room where they were lying open, is a distinction without much practical difference. She had sight of Foreign Office material during the years when Britain was constructing the Entente with France, managing a deteriorating relationship with Germany, and negotiating with Russia. She never repeated it. In 12 years, with access of that kind, in a London that ran on gossip, she gave nothing away. That is the discipline that got her the position, and it is the discipline that kept it. And she was used. Ministers who could not manage the king went through her. The king was difficult. He was quick-tempered, easily bored, prone to taking constitutional questions personally, and possessed of a settled dislike for the Liberal government that came in with the landslide of 1906. Asquith, Lloyd George and Winston Churchill were, in his private estimation, a set of people determined to dismantle the country in order to be popular in it. Getting him to receive a proposal calmly was a genuine problem of state, and the people whose job it was to solve that problem discovered that the most efficient route ran through a house in Portman Square. She was, in the plainest possible terms, an unofficial channel between the cabinet and the crown, operating with no appointment, no salary, no accountability, and no legal existence. Now hold that against the 1909 budget. David Lloyd George, as Chancellor, brought forward a budget in 1909 designed to fund old age pensions and a naval building program by taxing land and high incomes. The House of Lords, which was hereditary, conservative, and heavily landed, rejected it, which broke a convention 2 centuries old that the Lords did not touch finance bills. That rejection produced the worst constitutional crisis Britain had faced since the Great Reform Bill. The mechanism required to break the deadlock was appalling. To force the budget through, the government needed the king to promise to create enough new peers to swamp the Lords. Hundreds of them. And the king, who was 67 and ill, and who regarded the whole business as a piece of political theatre being conducted at his expense, would have to agree in advance to destroy the independence of the upper house of his own parliament. He spent the winter of 1909 and the early months of 1910 trying to find any route that did not end there. He pushed for a second general election. He tried to get the parties into a conference. He was, in his own view, being maneuvered by ministers into a position where the crown would be seen to have taken a side in a party fight, which is the one thing a constitutional monarch cannot survive doing. Alice Keppel was with him through all of it, at Sandringham, in London, and at Biarritz in the spring of 1910, while the crisis was still unresolved. She was, so far as any of this can be reconstructed, on the side of settlement, and her instinct throughout was toward keeping him calm and keeping the temperature down. What she actually said to him about the Parliament Bill is unrecoverable, and I am not going to invent it. What can be said is that during the gravest constitutional emergency of the era, a woman with no official position whatsoever was in daily proximity to the monarch, had sight of the papers, and was in regular contact with senior figures on the government side. That is either a scandal of the first order or a piece of informal statecraft of the sort that pre-democratic systems ran on constantly, and reasonable people can disagree, but nobody should pretend it was decorative. It was left out of the official record entirely. Sir Sidney Lee's Authorized Life of the King, published in the 1920s, is the standard work for a generation, and it handles her with a pair of tongs, at maximum extension. The reader of that book learns nothing about the woman who was in the room. Now, Biarritz, because the annual pattern of his life tells you more about the relationship than any single incident does. The Edwardian court moved on a calendar as fixed as a liturgy. London for the season. Ascot in June, Cowes in August, then Marienbad in Bohemia for the cure, which meant drinking sulphurous water in the morning and eating enormous dinners in the evening, in the belief that these cancelled out Balmoral and the shooting in the autumn, Sandringham for Christmas, and for his birthday in November. And in March, when England was still filthy with winter, Biarritz. Biarritz was the fixed point. He went every spring for the last years of his life, took a suite at the Hôtel du Palais on the Atlantic coast of the French Basque country, and stayed 6 weeks or more. He motored in the afternoons, he walked, he held a court in exile that was attended by the local French administration, the visiting British, and whoever from London had a reason to come south. Alice Keppel was there every year, sometimes with George, sometimes with the girls. The party was assembled around her presence as a matter of routine, and the French, who had a longer and more relaxed tradition regarding these arrangements than the British did, handled it without difficulty. Alexandra was not there. Alexandra went cruising in the Mediterranean, on the royal yacht, usually with her sister, the Dowager Empress of Russia. Every spring, for years, the King of England and the Queen of England went to separate countries with separate companions and returned separately, and the arrangement was administered by private secretaries with the smoothness of a railway timetable. And in March of 1910, he went to Biarritz for the last time. He was in poor condition before he left. He had bronchitis, he was overweight, he was smoking a dozen cigars a day plus cigarettes, and he had spent the winter in the constitutional crisis. His doctors wanted him to go south. He went. He became seriously ill within days of arriving, and he was confined to his rooms at the Palais for over a week while the party around him tried to keep the extent of it out of the newspapers. He recovered enough to be seen out, and then he stayed on into late April, past the point where London was becoming restless about a king who was absent, while the Constitution was in the balance, and there was comment in the press about it. Some of it pointed, some of it aimed squarely at the company he was keeping. He came back to Buckingham Palace on the 27th of April 1910. He was dead 9 days later. Before we go to the death, one more thing about those Biarritz years, and it comes from the daughters, and it is the closest thing we have to a domestic photograph of the arrangement. Sonia Keppel, the younger daughter, published a memoir in 1958 called Edwardian Daughter. She was born in 1900, so her memories of the king run from about 1904 to his death, which is to say, from the age of 4 to the age of 10. And what she describes is a large, wheezing, immensely genial old man who came to the house, whom she knew as Kingy, and who played a game with her involving bread and butter and the slope of his trouser leg, racing the slices down the fabric and betting on which would reach the bottom first. She had no idea who he was. She writes about that with the dry self-awareness of a woman looking back across 50 years at a child who thought a king was simply a fat friend of her mother's who came for tea. There are two ways to read that memoir. The warm reading is that it shows a household that was, whatever else it was, affectionate and unstrained, and that a small girl in it was happy. The cold reading is that Sonia Keppel wrote a whole book about her childhood in 1958, when she was 58 years old, and her mother had been dead for 11 years, and managed to produce an account in which the central fact of that childhood is present on every page and stated on none of them. Both readings are correct. That is the family, exactly. Warm, funny, hospitable, and organized at every level around a thing that would not be said. Violet, the elder, took it very differently, and we will get to Violet, because what happened to Violet Keppel is the price of all this, and it is the part of the story that will make you angry. But first, the 6th of May 1910, and what happened in the room. He came back from Biarritz on the 27th of April, and he was finished, and everyone around him could see it except him. The bronchitis he had picked up in France had never cleared. He was coughing badly enough that conversation was difficult. He was 68 years old. He weighed considerably more than a man of his height should have weighed, and he had spent 50 years treating his own body as a resource that could be drawn on without limit. His doctors, Sir James Reed among them, wanted him in bed. He declined. What he did instead was work, which is the detail that complicates every easy judgment about him. This is a man whose entire public reputation was built on pleasure, and in the final week of his life, with a constitutional crisis unresolved and his lungs failing, he was receiving ministers, going through the boxes, and holding audiences. On the 2nd of May he saw Asquith, who had come back from a Mediterranean cruise to find his sovereign visibly dying and his government still unable to pass a budget. He was still working through the 3rd and the 4th. By the 5th, he was receiving several people and smoking a cigar afterwards, having been told not to, because he had never in his life accepted an instruction about a cigar from anybody. That evening he began to have heart attacks. Not one. A series of them, through the night and into the following day, each leaving him weaker and more confused, and by the morning of the 6th of May, the household understood that this would be the last day. Queen Alexandra had been in Corfu. She was sent for, and she got back to London late on the 5th, which is its own small piece of the story, because it means that the wife of the King of England was in Greece while he was dying, and had to be summoned home by telegram. And on the 6th of May, sometime in the afternoon, Alice Keppel came to Buckingham Palace. The accounts of what followed come principally from Sir Frederick Ponsonby, who was Assistant Private Secretary and who was in the palace, and from Reginald Brett, Lord Esher, who was not in the room but was closely involved in everything surrounding it and wrote a great deal down. Neither man was hostile to her. Ponsonby in particular knew her socially and had no axe to sharpen. What they describe is nonetheless not a scene that does her credit, and I think the honest thing is to say that plainly and then explain it. She came with the letter. It had been written some years earlier, at a point when the king had been ill and had thought about what would happen, and it said that in the event of his final illness, she was to be sent for. Whether she produced it to the household, or whether it had already been communicated to Queen Alexandra in advance, is one of the details the sources handle differently. Alexandra sent for her. I keep coming back to this because it is genuinely astonishing, and because no explanation of it is fully satisfying. A woman who had spent 47 years married to this man, who had been publicly and repeatedly humiliated, who was deaf and tired, and who had just been recalled from Corfu to watch him die, made the decision to bring his mistress into the room and to shake her hand. The most likely reading is that Alexandra was honoring what she understood to be his wish. She had seen the letter, or been told of it. She believed he wanted the woman there, and she was not going to be the person who denied a dying man something he had asked for in writing. There is also the possibility, which cannot be proven, and which I find persuasive, that Alexandra had long since stopped experiencing Alice Keppel as a rival, and had begun experiencing her as a fixture, in the way that people who live inside a long-running arrangement stop reacting to it. What is agreed is that Alexandra said something brief and correct, and then withdrew to the window and left them, and the king did not know her. He was semi-conscious by then, drifting, and the accounts suggest he did not recognize the woman standing at his bedside, or recognized her only intermittently, or said something that did not connect. For Alice Keppel, this appears to have been the moment the structure came apart. She had built 12 years on being the person he wanted in the room, and she had arrived at the last room, and he was not there to want her. She became distressed, and then more than distressed. Ponsonby's account has her saying, in front of the household, that she would be ruined, that nobody would speak to her now, that everything was over. She was crying loudly enough to be a problem in a sick room, and she had to be taken out, physically assisted, to another room, where she remained for some time, in a state that the period described as hysterics, and that we would probably describe as a collapse. Now, the temptation here is to read that scene as the mask slipping, the mercenary calculation revealed at last, the woman crying not for the man but for the position. That reading is available, and it was made at the time by people in the palace who had never liked her. I think it is too neat. Consider the specific words attributed to her. She was saying that she would never be spoken to again, that she would be cut off. And she was factually correct about that. Her entire standing in English society was contained in one relationship with no legal or institutional form, and she was watching it end in real time, in a room full of people who would within days have no reason to acknowledge her existence. 12 years of work, and the daughter's futures, and the money, and the position, all of it resting on a man who had just stopped being able to recognize her face. That she also, quite possibly, loved him seems to me neither provable nor especially unlikely, and the two things are not in competition. People are capable of grieving for a person and for their own ruin in the same afternoon, and the fact that they cannot separate the two while it is happening is a fairly ordinary feature of human beings rather than evidence of fraud. What I will say is this. It is the only recorded occasion in a life of nearly 80 years on which Alice Keppel lost control of a room. The single lapse, at the single moment when there was nothing left to manage. The king died at 1:15 on the 6th of May, 1910. Earlier that day he had been told that his horse, Witch of the Air, had won at Kempton Park, and he had said he was very glad, which is the last thing of his that anybody thought worth writing down. That detail has been used for a century to make a point about the frivolity of the man, and it always seems to me to make the opposite point, because a person who is having heart attacks all afternoon and can still take pleasure in a horse he owns, winning a race he will never hear about again, is displaying something other than shallowness. And then the machinery started. The funeral was on the 20th of May, and it was the largest gathering of European royalty ever assembled, 9 reigning monarchs following the coffin, an event that historians have used ever since as the closing image of the old order, because 4 years later, most of them were at war with each other. Alice Keppel had no place in any part of it, no official capacity, no acknowledgement, no line in the order of service. She had, in the space of a fortnight, gone from a woman whose presence was a condition of every royal invitation in Britain to a private person of no particular importance. The papers went next. Edward VII's private correspondence was culled after his death, on a scale that has frustrated historians ever since. Queen Alexandra was directly involved in some of the destruction, and Lord Esher, who had a semi-official standing as keeper of the royal record, was involved in decisions about what survived. Francis Knollys, who had been the king's private secretary for 4 decades and knew everything, participated in the tidying. Letters were burned in quantity. None of this was unusual for the period, and it is important to be accurate about that. Victorian and Edwardian households burned correspondence as a matter of course, and royal households did it more thoroughly than most. There is no conspiracy required to explain the disappearance of a monarch's private letters in 1910. What there is a set of choices about which categories of thing were worth keeping, and the correspondence of Alice Keppel was not one of them. And she did her own side herself. This is the part of the destruction that was entirely voluntary, and that reveals the most about her. She had 37 more years to live. She had letters from a king covering 12 years, which had commercial value in 1910, that is difficult to overstate, and historical value that is incalculable now. She destroyed them, and there is no indication that anyone asked her to. Then, in 1912, Reginald Esher and Sir Sidney Lee began the work that became the official biography, and the official biography did to her memory what the bonfires had done to her letters. Lee's 2-volume Life of Edward VII is a substantial and in many ways careful piece of work, and on the subject of the king's private life, it is a document of extraordinary evasiveness. The reader who comes to it knowing nothing would finish it, knowing nothing. That was the commission, and Lee fulfilled it. And because it was the authorized life, written with access to the papers that had survived the culling, it became the foundation that everything else was built on for the next 50 years. Which is how you erase somebody. You write the account that everyone else will summarize from, you leave her out of it, and you let time do the rest. Denial never comes into it. The Keppels left England in the autumn of 1910. They went east. Ceylon first, then on through the Far East, taking in China, on the kind of extended tour that upper-class English people undertook when the domestic weather had become unfavorable and would benefit from a change of hemisphere. They took Violet, who was 16, and Sonia, who was 10. They stayed away for 2 years. There was no announcement, no explanation, and no drama attached to the departure. It was simply understood. Whose decision it was is unrecorded, and there is a reasonable case that it was made for her rather than by her. The court of George V had no use for his father's arrangements, and Queen Mary had a settled view about women of that kind, and it would have been entirely consistent with how these things were managed for a suggestion to have been conveyed through a third party that a period abroad might suit everybody. Whoever decided it, it was the correct decision, and Alice Keppel executed it perfectly. Think about what remaining in London would have required. Every hostess in England would have had to decide whether to invite her. Every one of those decisions would have been a small public statement about the late king, made in the first year of a new reign by people who wanted to be asked to Buckingham Palace. She would have become a permanent low-grade embarrassment, and eventually somebody would have said something in print, and then it would have been a subject. By removing herself entirely for 2 years, she took the decision away from everybody. There was nobody to invite or not invite. The question could not arise. And when she came back in 1912, a new king had been on the throne for 2 years, a coronation had happened, and London had moved on to other people. She returned to a house in Grosvenor Street, and she resumed, in a lower register, the thing she had always done, which was to be the best company in London. The war came, and the Keppels did what their class did. George, who was nearly 50, went back into uniform. Alice did war work, involving herself with hospital provision, and she was in France for a period of it. Violet and Sonia grew up inside a country that was losing a generation of the young men they would otherwise have married, and both of their subsequent lives are unintelligible without that. And the social recovery, across those years, was almost total. By the 1920s, Alice Keppel was an established and prosperous London figure with an interesting past that people alluded to and nobody discussed. She entertained, she was quoted. Osbert Sitwell and his circle enjoyed her enormously. There is a much-repeated line about her having handled the whole thing so well, delivered by her in later life about the abdication of 1936, in which she observed that things were done better in her day. Whether she said it in exactly those words is uncertain, and it has been polished by retelling, but it is the sort of thing she said, and the sentiment behind it was entirely sincere. She meant it as a professional judgment, and on the evidence she was right. She had conducted a 12-year relationship with a monarch without a single public incident, extracted herself in a fortnight, removed herself for 2 years, come back and rebuilt, and never once given a newspaper a sentence to print. The cost of that discipline was real, and it was substantial, and Alice Keppel did not pay it. Her elder daughter did. Violet Keppel was 10 years old when she met Vita Sackville-West at a tea party in London, and she decided more or less immediately that this was the person her life was going to be about, and she turned out to be right for the next 16 years, and arguably for the next 60. Vita was 12. She was the only child of Lionel Sackville-West, 3rd Baron Sackville, and she lived at Knowle in Kent, which is a house of such preposterous scale that it is easier to describe by its legend than its dimensions. The Calendar House, a room for every day of the year. Vita loved Knowle with an intensity that shaped everything she ever wrote, and she could not inherit it, because she was a girl, and the entail passed to an uncle. That is worth holding on to, because it means the 2 girls at that tea party had something in common that neither of them could have articulated at the time. Both of them had been raised inside enormous privilege, and both of them had worked out early that the privilege came with a locked door, and that the lock was their sex. Vita's own background had a complication in it that made her, of all Violet's possible friends, the one least likely to be shocked by anything. Her mother, Victoria, was the illegitimate daughter of the 2nd Baron Sackville and a Spanish dancer called Pepita, and the family had been through a public court case about it. Vita grew up knowing that her own mother's legitimacy had been argued over by barristers in front of the newspapers. Respectability, in that household, was understood to be a construction rather than a state of nature. So here are 2 clever, theatrical, restless girls, one of whom will grow up watching her mother conduct a public relationship with the King of England, and the other of whom has already learned that the rules bend if the family is grand enough. They spent their adolescence in and out of each other's houses. They wrote to each other constantly, and somewhere in there, on Violet's side certainly, and on Vita's side eventually, it became something other than friendship. In 1913, Vita married Harold Nicholson, a young diplomat, and it was in most respects a very successful marriage that lasted until her death, produced 2 sons, and accommodated the fact that both partners were principally attracted to their own sex. Harold knew. Vita knew about Harold. They wrote each other letters of great tenderness for 50 years while conducting entirely separate romantic lives, and the arrangement worked because both of them wanted the same thing from it, which was a home and a companion and a person who would never be shocked. That marriage is the closest 20th century equivalent to what Alice and George Keppel had built, and I want you to notice the resemblance, because it makes what happens next considerably worse. The thing between Violet and Vita became serious in the spring of 1918. The country was in the 4th year of the war, and in the middle of the German spring offensive, and the 2 of them went down to Cornwall, to Polperro, and stayed there together. Violet was 23, Vita was 26, and a married woman with 2 small sons. What happened in Cornwall is described in Vita's own later account, written privately and not published in her lifetime, and it reads as the moment a woman in her middle 20s discovered what she actually was, after a decade of not having the vocabulary for it. And then they came back to London and did something that in retrospect looks like a dare. Vita began dressing as a man. She had a costume, she had a bandage on her head suggesting a wound, and she had a name, Julian. She was tall and dark and could carry it, and she walked out in wartime London with Alice Keppel on her arm, through streets full of soldiers on leave, and they went to restaurants and got into cabs, and were addressed as Sir, and nobody caught them, and both of them found it intoxicating, in a way that neither of them ever quite got over. They went to France together in late 1918, to Paris, and then to Monte Carlo, and stayed for months while Europe was signing the armistice, and the influenza was killing more people than the war had. Now the pressure begins, and it comes from both mothers, and Alice Keppel is the more effective of the two. Violet was 24 and unmarried in 1918, which in her class and her generation was starting to be a problem, and it was about to become a much larger problem because the war had removed an enormous proportion of the men she would have been expected to choose from. Alice Keppel wanted her daughter married. The reasons were partly the ordinary ones and partly specific, because Alice Keppel had spent her entire adult life inside a structure that was tolerated precisely because it was contained within a marriage, and she understood better than almost anybody in England what marriage was for in structural terms. It was the container. Without it, there was nothing to be discreet inside. The man selected was Denis Trefusis. Denis was a major in the Royal Horse Guards. He had a good war. He had been badly affected by it in ways the period had no language for. He spoke Russian, and he was by all accounts a decent, private, rather austere man who was genuinely in love with Violet Keppel. And Violet, before agreeing to marry him, extracted a promise from him that the marriage would never be consummated. He agreed. Consider that for a moment, and consider what it says about how much he wanted her, and consider what it was going to be like to be him for the next 10 years. They were married on the 16th of June 1919 at St. George's, Hanover Square. Vita was in the church. Violet had written to her beforehand in terms that made the whole thing sound like an execution, being attended by the condemned. Alice Keppel had got what she wanted, which was a son-in-law, a settlement, and a container. What she had actually produced was a bomb with a 9-month fuse. Because the marriage did not work for a single day, and the two of them left for France almost immediately after the wedding with Vita following, and the next 18 months are the most extraordinary sequence in this entire story. Before I take you into it, let me say the second thing I have to say. If you are still here, an hour and a half in, then you are the person this channel is made for, and I would like you to subscribe if you have not already. Hit the bell as well, because the notification is the only thing that reliably tells you when the next one goes up. What is coming in the next section is the part of this story that almost never gets told properly, because it involves 2 women in 1920, and because for 50 years, the people who owned the letters had every reason to keep them in a locked bag. Subscribing costs you nothing, and it is the single thing that decides whether the research budget for the next one exists. Do it now, and then let us go to France. They ran. Through the back half of 1919 and into 1920, Violet and Vita were repeatedly in France together, and the intention hardened from an affair into a plan. They were going to leave, permanently. Vita would leave Harold, Violet would leave Denis, and the two of them would live abroad together, and the money, which is always the question, would come from Vita's expectations and whatever Violet could extract. In February of 1920 they went, and they got as far as Amiens. What happened at Amiens is the scene that everybody who knows this story knows, and it is worth telling carefully, because the standard telling makes it into a farce, and it was not a farce for anybody involved. Harold Nicholson and Denis Trefusis went after them, together, the husband of one and the husband of the other, in the same party, on the same errand. They crossed to France, and they chartered a small aircraft, which in February of 1920 was an act of some seriousness, aviation being 4 months old as a civilian proposition and considerably more dangerous than the train. They flew to Amiens to retrieve their wives. And the confrontation, when it came, did not turn on the husbands at all. It turned on a question. Vita asked Violet whether she had slept with Denis. The promise of a celibate marriage had been the guarantee underneath the whole thing, the proof that Violet belonged to her and to nobody else, and at Amiens Vita became convinced that the promise had been broken and that she had been lied to about it. Whether it had been broken is not knowable now. Violet denied it. Denis, according to the accounts that survive, indicated otherwise, or was understood to have indicated otherwise, in a room where 4 people were in a state of total emotional collapse. Vita believed him, and that was the end of it, though it took another year of wreckage before either of them accepted that. It is a terrible scene when you sit with it. 4 people in a French hotel, 2 of them married to each other on paper and in love with other people, one of them a shell-shocked cavalry officer who had agreed to a celibate marriage to a woman who did not want him and was now being interrogated about it in front of his own wife, and one of them a diplomat who had flown across the channel in an open aeroplane to collect a wife he loved and could not hold. Nobody in that room was a villain. That is what makes it unbearable. And now Alice Keppel. Because the relationship did not end at Amiens, not immediately. Violet and Vita went on trying through 1920 and into 1921, in a diminishing series of meetings and letters and attempted escapes, and something had to close it down, and what closed it down was Violet's mother. Alice Keppel went to work with the full apparatus she had spent 30 years assembling. She controlled the money, and Violet's income came through her family, and it was made clear what would happen to it. She used her social network, which by 1920 was as good as anybody's in England, and she made sure that the relevant people understood the position. She coordinated with Lady Sackville, Vita's mother, who was applying pressure from the other side with a rather less delicate touch and a good deal more shouting. She traveled. She involved herself directly and personally at every level of her daughter's life. And she won, comprehensively, in the way she always won. Violet was removed from England. She lived the rest of her life principally in France, at Saint-Lô-de-Naude, outside Paris, and later in a house near Florence, and she remained married to Denis Trefusis, on paper, in a marriage that had never been anything, until he died of tuberculosis in 1929, at the age of 38. She was 35 years old, and she had been a widow of a marriage that never existed, in exile from her own country for 9 years. She became a novelist, and a good one. She wrote in both English and French. Broderie Anglaise, published in French in 1935, is a novel about a woman writing about a love triangle involving a character based on Vita, and it is a sharper piece of work than it has any right to be given the circumstances of its composition. She had a long association with Winnaretta Singer, the Princesse de Polignac, the sewing machine heiress who was one of the great musical patrons of the century. She was a fixture of Paris society. She was, by most accounts, formidable, difficult, extremely funny, and permanently unhappy, in a way she converted into performance. And Virginia Woolf, who was in love with Vita in the mid-1920s, put Violet into Orlando as the Russian princess, which means that the most famous literary portrait of Violet Keppel was written by her rival. Now, the judgment, because there has to be one. The easy verdict on Alice Keppel here is hypocrisy, and it is very easy indeed. Here is a woman who conducted an open extramarital relationship for 12 years with the King of England, who was financed by it, whose entire social position was built on it, and who then destroyed her own daughter's life for conducting an extramarital relationship of her own. The double standard is so blatant that the story practically tells itself. I have thought about this a great deal, and I think the hypocrisy charge, while satisfying, is the shallower reading, and the deeper one is worse. Alice Keppel understood the system she had operated in with total precision, and she knew 4 things about it that Violet either did not know or refused to accept. Start with consent. Her own arrangement had been permitted because every adult inside it agreed to it. George consented, Alexandra consented, the society consented by agreeing not to write it down. Violet's arrangement had a husband who had been tricked into a celibate marriage and a second husband who had not been consulted at all, and it produced a scene in a French hotel involving a chartered aircraft. Nobody had consented to anything. Then there is the matter of sex. and in 1920, this was no small technical distinction. Alice Keppel's relationship had been with a man. Two women running away together was, in the England of that year, a thing that could not be tolerated even privately, by the class that tolerated a great deal privately. And the reason it could not be tolerated is that it did not produce heirs, did not sit inside a marriage, and could not be pretended not to have happened. Discretion was the price of everything, and Violet had none at all. She wrote letters that were dangerous. She made scenes. She threatened, at various points, to make it all public. Alice Keppel had spent 12 years never once giving anybody a sentence to print, and she watched her daughter hand out ammunition to anyone who wanted it. And underneath all of it, the thing that actually explains her, sits the fact that the permission was never transferable. Alice Keppel's position had never been a right that she had won and could pass on. It was a tolerance, extended to her personally, by specific people, in specific conditions, and it could be withdrawn at any moment by anyone who found it convenient to withdraw it. She knew that better than anybody alive, because she had watched it be withdrawn from her in the space of a fortnight in May of 1910. So when her daughter behaved as though the family had been granted an exemption from the rules, Alice Keppel understood immediately that no such exemption existed, and that acting as though it did would destroy them all. She was right about the danger, and she was ruthless about the remedy, and the remedy cost her daughter 40 years. Which is the thing I want to leave you with before we go on to Sonia, because it is the pattern that will repeat. Alice Keppel's method worked. It worked beautifully for her, in her conditions, in her decade, and every single person who inherited it, in every generation that followed, tried to run the same method in conditions that had changed, and it went wrong every time, and the wrongness got progressively more public until it ended up on the front page of a newspaper in 1993. Violet was the first person to discover that what got handed down was the exposure rather than the skill. Sonia Keppel was 6 years younger than her sister, and she watched everything that happened to Violet, and she drew a conclusion, and the conclusion governed the rest of her life. She would be conventional, aggressively, unshakably, professionally conventional. Whatever her mother was, Sonia Keppel would be the opposite of it, and whatever her sister had done, Sonia Keppel would do the reverse, and she would build a life that nobody could ever write about. She very nearly managed it. On the 16th of November 1920, 5 months after Violet's disastrous wedding, and while the wreckage in France was still smoking, Sonia married Roland Calvert Cubitt at St. George's, Hanover Square, in the same church her sister had been married in. She was 20, he was 22, and the heir to the second Baron Ashcombe. The Cubitts are worth pausing on, because the class comedy in this marriage is superb, and almost nobody points it out. Thomas Cubitt was a builder, not a gentleman with an interest in architecture, a builder who started with a carpentry business and became the greatest master builder in England in the 19th century. He built most of Belgravia. He built Osborne House on the Isle of Wight for Victoria and Albert. He put up the front of Buckingham Palace. He made an enormous fortune out of bricks and mortar, and his descendants converted it into a peerage in 1892, which is very recent as these things are counted. So, the Cubitts were trade money that had gone up in the world within living memory, and they were correspondingly rigid about respectability, in the specific way that families are when the money is new enough that somebody can still remember where it came from. And they did not want Sonia Keppel. The second Baron Ashcombe objected to the marriage, and the objection was about her mother. The reported version of his position is that no Cubitt had ever married a Keppel, and that no Keppel had ever been faithful to a Cubitt, or words arranged to that effect. And I offer that as a family story, rather than a verified quotation, because it has the polish of something improved by 50 years of retelling. What is solid is that there was resistance, and that the resistance was about Alice. Consider the position from Sonia's side. She was 20 years old, and marrying into a family of builders who had been ennobled 8 years before she was born, and they were looking down on her, and they were right to, in the sense that they had identified the thing she was running from. The daughter of a king's mistress marrying the great-grandson of a bricklayer, and the bricklayers holding their noses. They married anyway, and Sonia set about her project. 3 children came. Rosalind in 1921, Henry in 1924, Jeremy in 1927. Sonia ran a proper house, kept proper company, said nothing interesting to anybody, and constructed exactly the life she had set out to construct, which was a life with no story in it. And it fell apart anyway. The marriage failed. She and Roland Cubitt divorced in 1947, after 27 years. And the timing of that is one of those coincidences that a novelist would be advised to cut for implausibility, because 1947 is also the year her mother died and the year her granddaughter was born. I find Sonia the saddest person in this story, and she is the one nobody writes about, which she would have regarded as a success. Think about what her life actually consisted of. She spent her childhood inside a household organized around a fact that could not be named, and she was too young to understand it while it was happening, and she worked out later exactly what she had been living in. She responded by building a fortress of ordinariness. She married into a family that despised her mother. She raised 3 children with a determination that none of them should ever be interesting to a newspaper. She wrote a memoir in her 50s that describes her entire childhood without once stating the central fact of it. And her reward, 60 years after her death, is that the only reason anybody knows her name is that she was the link in the chain between the mistress and the queen. The thing she spent her life trying not to be is the only thing she is remembered as. Her daughter Rosalind married Bruce Shand in January of 1946. He was a cavalry officer, 12th Royal Lancers, who had a very good war indeed, 2 military crosses, and a spell as a prisoner in Germany after being wounded and captured in North Africa. He became a wine merchant. They were, by every account of everyone who knew them, an exceptionally happy couple, and they raised their children in Sussex with a normality that was entirely genuine rather than constructed. And on the 17th of July, 1947, Rosalind Shand gave birth to a daughter, and they named her Camilla Rosemary. Alice Keppel was alive. She was 79 years old, and she was at her villa outside Florence, and she had 8 weeks to live. And somewhere in that summer, the news would have reached her that her granddaughter had produced a great-granddaughter, and it is entirely possible that nobody thought it worth writing down what she said about it. Which brings us to Florence, and to the last 20 years of her life, and to the strangest and most attractive part of the whole story. In 1925, the Keppels bought the Villa dell'Ombrellino. It sits on the hill at Bellosguardo, immediately southwest of Florence, and the position is one of the great positions in Europe. The whole city is laid out below you, the Duomo, and the tower of the Palazzo Vecchio, and the river, and behind you the hills go on towards Siena. Galileo had lived at Bellosguardo, so had a long procession of writers and exiles and English people with money and time. The Keppels restored it, laid out the gardens, filled it with furniture and pictures, and turned it into one of the 2 or 3 most sought-after houses in the Anglo-Florentine world for the next 15 years. That world deserves a moment of its own. In the 1920s and 30s, Florence held a large, wealthy, cultivated, and extremely gossipy colony of British and American expatriates who had come for the art and stayed for the exchange rate. Bernard Berenson was at Ai-Tatti a few miles away, adjudicating the attribution of Italian paintings for the world's museums and dealers. Harold Acton was at La Pietra. Norman Douglas came and went. There were scholars and aesthetes and dealers and a great many people whose principal occupation was lunch. And Alice Keppel presided over a substantial part of it. She was, by the 1930s, the last witness. That is the thing that gave her position in Florence its particular flavor. Everyone else in that dining room had read about Edwardian England. She had been the center of it. She had known the king, the Kaiser had been rude to her, she had watched the Parliament Bill crisis from inside the room, and she could tell you what any of them had been like across a dinner table. She was living history in a colony that valued exactly that, and she played the role with total command. She was also, by all accounts, still extremely good company, and had become somewhat grand and a little absurd with age, in the manner of formidable old women who have stopped needing anyone's approval. Harold Acton and his circle enjoyed her enormously and were funny about her behind her back, which is the correct relationship to have with an institution. George was there throughout, tall, courteous, deaf by then, endlessly amiable, doing the flowers and the wine and being pleasant to guests. In the 50th year of a performance he never broke character in. Then the politics arrived. The Anglo-Florentine colony's relationship with fascism is a subject that its survivors handled with enormous delicacy in their memoirs, and that historians have been less delicate about since. A considerable portion of that community found Mussolini acceptable, and some found him admirable, for the reasons that wealthy foreign residents in the 1920s frequently did, which had to do with order, with the trains, with the absence of strikes, and with a settled dislike of the alternative. Britain's own governing class was not free of the same sympathies during those years. I am not going to make a specific claim about Alice Keppel's private politics, because the record is not good enough to support one, and inventing it would be exactly the kind of thing this script has spent 2 hours refusing to do. What can be said is that she lived in fascist Italy for 15 years, that she was on comfortable terms with the society around her, and that she stayed until staying became impossible. In June of 1940, Italy entered the war, and British nationals had to get out. The Keppels left. They were both over 70. They came back to England, and they spent the war years there, in a country they had not properly lived in for 2 decades. And Alice Keppel finished the war in London. Violet had her own escape in 1940. She had been living in France, and France fell, and she got out and came to England, and she spent the war in the country she had been exiled from 20 years earlier, working and writing and being difficult, and being at last in the same country as her mother again. Whatever passed between the two of them in those years is not on the record. And the Ombrellino was not there when they came back, or rather it was there, but the war had gone through Belosgardo, and the German line had run across those hills in the summer of 1944, when the Allies came up through Tuscany, and Florence had lost every bridge but the Ponte Vecchio, and houses on that ridge had been fought over. They returned in 1946 anyway, both of them close to 80, going back to a damaged house in a wrecked country to restart a life that had been designed for a world that had now ended twice. She had about a year and a half. Alice Keppel died at the Villa dell'Ombrellino on the 11th of September 1947. She was 79. The cause was cirrhosis of the liver, which in a woman of her generation and her habits of hospitality is neither surprising nor especially shameful, and is nonetheless the sort of detail that gets left out of the affectionate accounts. George Keppel died 2 months later, in November. He had been married to her for 56 years. He had spent 12 of those years as the husband of the king's mistress, and 44 of them as the husband of a woman whose position rested on nothing except herself. And he had gone abroad with her, come back with her, moved to Italy with her, been driven out of Italy with her, returned with her, and then, when she stopped. Whatever the arrangement between those two had been, and it began in circumstances that invite the worst possible reading, it ended with a man who did not last 2 months without her. I said in the first hour that George Keppel was the least examined person in this story. That is his answer, and he gave it in the only way he ever gave anything, which was by not saying a word. Violet inherited the Ombrellino. She lived there for the rest of her life, dividing her time between Florence and France, writing, entertaining, holding court on the same terrace her mother had held court on, and being talked about by the same colony. She died in 1972, at Saint-Lô-de-Naude, aged 78. Sonia died in 1986, aged 86. She had lived long enough to see her granddaughter Camilla married to Andrew Parker Bowles, and long enough to see the Prince of Wales married to Lady Diana Spencer, and long enough to watch the beginning of what came next. Whether she understood what she was watching is unrecorded, because Sonia Cubitt, as ever, said nothing. And that would be the end of the story. A woman of great skill who operated inside a system that permitted her, who was written out of the record when the system changed, whose elder daughter was destroyed by assuming the permission was inheritable, and whose younger daughter spent 70 years being deliberately uninteresting. Closed, finished, a footnote for specialists, the sort of thing that turns up in a chapter of a book about Edwardian society and nowhere else. That is what it was, for 46 years. Then in 1993, a tape recording of a telephone conversation was published in a newspaper, and every element of it came back. The Lanes, at Plumpton in East Sussex, was a farmhouse with land, and by every account of everyone who was ever inside it, a happy one. Bruce and Rosalind Shand raised 3 children there: Camilla, born in 1947, Annabel, born in 1949, Mark, born in 1951, who grew up to be a conservationist and a traveler, and who died in New York in 2014 after a fall. The household ran on horses, dogs, mud, the Southdown hunt, and a father who had won 2 military crosses and never talked about either of them. There is a version of this story that requires Camilla Shand to have been raised in the shadow of her great-grandmother, brought up on the legend, taught from the cradle that the family had a certain kind of history with a certain kind of man. That version is very useful to people who want the whole thing to be a hereditary curse. The evidence for it is close to non-existent. What the evidence supports is that Alice Keppel was a subject the family did not particularly discuss, that the connection was known in the way that families know things without dwelling on them, and that Camilla Shand's upbringing was about ponies rather than about a dead Edwardian courtesan. Sonia Cubitt, the grandmother, was alive throughout that childhood, and Sonia Cubitt had spent her entire life declining to talk about her mother, and there is no reason to think she made an exception for her granddaughter. Camilla went to Dumbrells in Sussex, then to Queensgate School in South Kensington, then to Switzerland and to Paris, for the finishing that girls of her class were still being given in the middle 60s. She came out as a debutante in 1965, in one of the last seasons when that meant anything at all. She was popular, funny, horsey, unpretentious, and not remotely intellectual, and she had the quality that everybody who knew her in that period mentions, which is that she was extremely easy to be around. You will have noticed that this is the same quality Osbert Sitwell kept trying to describe about her great-grandmother, and I am going to resist making anything of that, because the temptation to build a bloodline out of a personality trait is exactly the trap this entire story sets. In 1971, she met the Prince of Wales, and now I owe you the thing I promised in the first hour. The story that everybody knows goes like this. At a polo match at Windsor, or at Smith's Lawn, Camilla Shand walked up to Charles, whom she had never met, and delivered a line. Her great-grandmother had been his great-great-grandfather's mistress, and then, depending on which version you have heard, either how about it, or so how about it, or some variant with the same construction. It is a magnificent line. It is bold, funny, filthy, self-aware, and it establishes her character in 14 words. Novelists work for months to write a line that good. Look at what it requires. It requires a 23-year-old woman who has never met the heir to the throne to approach him in public at a sporting event and propose sex by way of a genealogical footnote. It requires her to have the genealogy at her fingertips, which she would, but also to have decided in advance that this was the approach, and it requires the whole thing to have been witnessed by somebody who then preserved it accurately. Now trace the sourcing. The line appears in print in the 1990s, once the relationship had become a public subject, and the Keppel connection was being worked over by every newspaper in Britain. It is attributed to no named witness. There is no contemporaneous account, no diary, no letter, nothing from the 1970s at all. It arrives fully formed, 20 years after the event it describes, at the exact moment when a line like that was commercially valuable. And there is a competing account, from a woman who was actually there and who has spoken about it. Lucia Santa Cruz was the daughter of the Chilean ambassador to London. She was a friend of Charles from his Cambridge period. She was older than him, she was clever, and she was one of the small number of people at that stage of his life who talked to him as a person rather than as an institution, and she introduced him to Camilla Shand at her flat in the early 1970s. Her version is that she made a remark about the two of them having a family history, a joke about their respective ancestors, delivered by her as the person doing the introduction. Something to the effect that they should watch out, given what their forebears had got up to. That is a completely different scene. A mutual friend making a well-informed joke while introducing two people at a private gathering is an ordinary thing that happens. A woman propositioning a prince across a polo ground is a scene from a film. The genealogy in the famous line is correct, incidentally, and that is part of why it persuades. Alice Keppel was Camilla's great-grandmother. Edward VII was Charles's great-great-grandfather. Whoever polished that line knew what they were doing. I cannot prove it was never said. Somebody may have repeated the joke afterwards in a version that put it in Camilla's mouth, and it may have travelled from there, and that is probably what happened. What I can tell you is that the version everybody knows has no source, and the version almost nobody knows has a named participant who has discussed it. and that the more famous a quotation is in this particular story, the less likely it is to be real. Which is the whole problem in one anecdote. Alice Keppel was erased and then reconstructed out of whatever material was entertaining, and the reconstruction got attached to her great-granddaughter, and now a woman who is Queen of the United Kingdom has a fictional sentence permanently welded to the story of how she met her husband. They became close in 1972. He went to sea with the Royal Navy in 1973, which took him out of the country for extended periods. And on the 4th of July 1973, at the Guards' Chapel at Wellington Barracks, Camilla Shand married Andrew Parker Bowles. Parker Bowles was a cavalry officer in the Blues and Royals, Catholic, charming, considerably experienced, and had at one point been involved with Princess Anne, which gives you a sense of the size of the pond. The marriage produced 2 children. Tom in 1974, whose godfather is the present king. Laura in 1978. It was, on the accounts that have been published, not a faithful marriage on either side for much of its duration, and it lasted 22 years. Charles married Lady Diana Spencer on the 29th of July, 1981, at St. Paul's Cathedral, in front of a global television audience that has been estimated at 750 million people. Now, everything that happened between 1981 and 1997 has been covered exhaustively, from every angle, by everyone, and I am not going to run through it again here, because you have seen it, and because this script is about something else. What I want to do instead is put the 2 arrangements side by side and show you why one of them held for 12 years and the other detonated. Take the 4 conditions from the first hour. Consent was the first of them, and it was total in Alice Keppel's case. George Keppel agreed. Queen Alexandra tolerated it and demonstrated the tolerance in the most public way available to her on the last day of her husband's life. Nobody involved had been deceived about the shape of the thing. In the second case, the wife had not agreed to anything. Diana Spencer was 19 years old at her engagement. She had met her fiancé a small number of times, and whatever she understood about the situation she was entering, she had not consented to it in any sense that the word can bear. That single difference is the largest one in the entire comparison, and it is the reason the moral arithmetic runs in opposite directions in the 2 centuries. The press was the second condition. Edwardian Fleet Street knew everything about Alice Keppel and printed none of it, for reasons of law, self-interest, and shared assumption. British newspapers in the 1980s and 90s operated under an entirely different commercial logic, in a circulation war of extraordinary ferocity, with photographers on motorbikes and a public appetite that the proprietors had spent a decade cultivating. The understanding that had protected the Edwardian court had been dead since the abdication and buried since the 1960s. The complacent husband was the third, and here the comparison is less straightforward than people assume, because Andrew Parker Bowles was by most accounts not a man consumed by jealousy. What he was, though, was a serving officer with a public position and a Catholic family, living in a country where the whole thing was going to end up in a newspaper, which George Keppel never had to contemplate for a single day. And the small society was the fourth. Alice Keppel's arrangement was known to a few thousand people who all had a personal interest in silence. By 1990, the equivalent circle included staff, drivers, detectives, friends who talked to journalists, and a national telephone network that could be listened to by anybody with the right equipment and a hobby. Take away the 4 conditions and run the same arrangement, and it does not produce 12 years of stability. It produces 1992. That year, which the Queen named in Latin at the Guildhall in November, ran as follows. Andrew Morton's book appeared in June, and it was understood at the time to have been written with cooperation from Kensington Palace, which was confirmed after Diana's death. A recording of a private telephone conversation involving the princess was published in August. The separation of the Prince and Princess of Wales was announced in December. Windsor Castle burned, and in January of 1993, a recording of a private telephone conversation between the Prince of Wales and Camilla Parker Bowles was published by newspapers in Britain and around the world. I am not going to describe its contents, and I would ask you to consider, for a moment, what it would be like to have the most private conversation of your life read aloud on radio programs in a dozen countries. That publication is the hinge of this entire script, because within days, every newspaper in Britain went looking for background on the woman at the other end of that telephone, and what they found was a great-grandmother. Alice Keppel came back into the public consciousness of the United Kingdom in the last week of January 1993, after 46 years of being a specialist footnote, and she came back as ammunition. No historian recovered her. No archive opened. No scholar published a reassessment. A circulation war reached a point of such intensity that it required fresh material every day for weeks, and somebody on a features desk worked out that the woman in the tape had a family history, and the family history was excellent copy. And the frame they built around it was the crude one. It runs in the family. The Keppel women have always done this, like great-grandmother, like great-granddaughter. That frame went round the world in about 72 hours, and it has never fully come off. Consider what it did. It took a woman who had been discreet for 12 years and silent for 37 more, whose defining professional characteristic was that she never gave anybody a sentence to print, and it turned her into a punchline in a story about her descendant, using material she had spent her life ensuring would not exist. She was disinterred in order to be used against somebody else. And because everything substantial about her had already been burned in 1910 and left out by Sidney Lee in the 1920s, there was nothing in the record to push back with. The erasure had removed the competence and left the shape, and the shape was available for anyone who needed one. That is why the erasure mattered, and it took 83 years for the bill to arrive. What followed 1993 was 4 years of controlled demolition. In June of 1994, the Prince of Wales sat down with Jonathan Dimbleby for a television documentary and acknowledged, in careful language, that he had been unfaithful after the marriage had broken down. In November of 1995, the Princess of Wales gave an interview to Panorama in which she said things about the marriage and about the woman in it that were repeated on every front page in the world, and which the BBC accepted in 2021 had been obtained by deception. The Parker-Bowles marriage ended in 1995. The Wales marriage ended in August of 1996. And on the 31st of August 1997, Diana, Princess of Wales, died in a car in a tunnel in Paris. I am not going to go through that week. What matters for this script is what it did to the position of one woman, which was to make her, for a period of years, the most disliked person in Britain. There was polling. There were incidents in public. The general expectation, held by serious people who understood the Constitution, was that Camilla Parker-Bowles would never be seen in public alongside the Prince of Wales again, that any marriage was constitutionally impossible, and that the situation would be managed by keeping her permanently out of sight. What happened instead was one of the most effective and least discussed public relations operations in modern British history. It was run principally by Mark Bolland, who came to the Prince's office from the Press Complaints Commission and who understood the British newspaper industry from the inside. The internal shorthand for the work was Operation PB, and the method was patience. The first step, in January of 1999, was a photograph. There was a party at the Ritz in London for the 50th birthday of Camilla's sister, Annabel Elliot, and the Prince and Camilla left the building together at the same time, in front of a phalanx of photographers who had been given every reason to expect it. They did not touch, they did not speak to the cameras. They walked down a short flight of steps and got into a car, and it was on every front page in the country the next morning. That was the entire event. 2 people leaving a building. It had been under consideration for the better part of a year, and it worked exactly as designed, because it converted an unmentionable fact into a photographed one, and once a thing has been photographed, it can be photographed again. The rest took 6 years. She appeared at more events. She was received by the Queen. She acquired, gradually, the status of a person who was simply there, and public opinion, which had been ferocious in 1997, softened by the degree that public opinion always softens when nothing dramatic happens for long enough. On the 9th of April, 2005, they married at the Guildhall in Windsor in a civil ceremony, followed by a service of prayer and dedication at St. George's Chapel. The Queen did not attend the civil ceremony, which was widely reported as a snub, and was more probably a matter of her position as Supreme Governor of the Church of England. She attended the blessing, and she hosted the reception, and she made a short speech at it about horses that was funnier than anything else said that day. It was announced at the time that the new wife of the Prince of Wales would use the title Duchess of Cornwall rather than Princess of Wales, and that when he came to the throne, she would be known as Princess Consort rather than Queen. That second undertaking did not survive. In February of 2022, on the 70th anniversary of her accession, Queen Elizabeth II issued a message stating her sincere wish that when the time came, Camilla should be known as Queen Consort. That single sentence, from that person, at that moment, settled a question that had been open for 17 years, and it settled it in a way that nobody could reopen without arguing with a dead sovereign. Elizabeth II died on the 8th of September 2022. And on the 6th of May 2023, at Westminster Abbey, Camilla was crowned alongside her husband, anointed and crowned as queen, in the first coronation of a queen consort since 1937. Now look at that date. Edward VII died on the 6th of May 1910. 113 years to the day after the king died in Buckingham Palace with Alice Keppel weeping in a room down the corridor, Alice Keppel's great-granddaughter was crowned Queen of the United Kingdom in Westminster Abbey. Nobody planned that. The coronation date was chosen for entirely practical reasons, involving the calendar, the weather, the school holidays, and the availability of an 800-year-old church. It is a coincidence, and it is the sort of coincidence that would be cut from a script for being too much, and it happens to be true. So, the argument, and then we are done. Let me first make the strongest possible case against everything I have told you, because if the case survives, it is worth something, and if it does not, you should know. The case against goes like this. There is no mystery here, and no pattern, and the whole thing is an artifact of a very small marriage market. The British upper class in the period covered by this script consisted of a few thousand families who married each other, hunted with each other, sent their sons to the same 6 schools, and their daughters to the same dances, and served in the same regiments. Proximity to the throne worked as a postcode rather than a talent. Any family that was inside that circle in 1900 was statistically likely to still be inside it in 1970, because the circle barely changed, and the mechanisms for entering and leaving it were slow. On that reading, Camilla Shand met the Prince of Wales for the same reason that hundreds of young women of her background met him, which is that she was in the pool. Lucia Santa Cruz introduced them because Lucia Santa Cruz knew both of them, and she knew both of them because that is what the circle is for. The Keppel connection is a genealogical curiosity that would be true of a great many families if you went looking, and the only reason this one is famous is that a newspaper needed it in 1993. Add to that the observation that both women were charming, funny, unintimidating, and good with difficult men, and you have the whole thing. 2 women, 4 generations apart, with similar temperaments, drawn from the same small pool, both of whom happen to appeal to a Prince of Wales. That is a serious argument. I have made it as well as I can, and a good deal of it is correct. The endogamy point in particular is unanswerable. Camilla Shand was in that world because 4 generations of her family had been in it, and the Cubit money, and the Albemarle name, and the Shand connections put her at the right parties. Anybody who tells you there was destiny involved is selling something, and it still leaves the thing it cannot explain. Because proximity accounts for the meeting, it does not account for the silence. Go back through the 4 generations and look at what each of these women did with the information she had. Alice Keppel had 12 years of correspondence with a king. She had the letter he wrote her about his own death. She had a market for all of it that would have made her rich twice over, and she had 37 years in which to use it, including a period in the 1930s when the abdication had made the whole subject commercially incandescent. She burned it, and nobody made her. Sonia Cubit wrote a memoir about her Edwardian childhood at the age of 58 and published it. The king is in that book. He is on the page, playing a game with bread and butter on a small girl's behalf, and the fact of what he was to her mother is not stated anywhere in it. She wrote a whole book around a hole, and she did it deliberately, and she did it well. Rosalind Shand, so far as any record shows, never discussed her grandmother publicly at all, and raised 3 children in Sussex who were not brought up on the legend. And Camilla has now been a public figure for more than 30 years, through the worst of it and out the other side, and has never given an interview about any of it. Not in 1993 when she was being destroyed daily and had every human motive to explain herself. Not in the years afterwards, not since. 4 women, 4 separate lifetimes, 4 completely different sets of circumstances, 4 opportunities to speak that would have been enormously profitable, and 4 refusals. That is not a postcode. Postcodes do not produce that. What it looks like, and I will put it no higher than that, is a transmitted discipline. Not taught, because there is no evidence anybody sat anybody down and explained it. Absorbed, in the way that children absorb the rules of the house they grow up in, which is by noticing what is never done. And here is the part that closes the circle. The thing that got erased from the record in 1910 was Alice Keppel's competence. Sidney Lee left it out. The bonfires took the evidence. The 1993 newspapers, finding nothing but a shape, filled it with a punchline. The woman who was consulted by the Foreign Office, who sat with state papers for 12 years and repeated nothing, who managed a constitutional monarch through the worst crisis of his reign, was reduced to a fat king's mistress with a good line about polo. And the competence was the only thing about her worth inheriting. It is also, on the evidence of 4 generations, the one thing that actually did get passed down. The position could never be transferred, and Violet was destroyed for assuming otherwise. The money ran out in the ordinary way that money does. What survived all of it was the discipline, the refusal, the absolute understanding that the thing which cannot be said is the thing that keeps you alive. Violet is the exception that proves it, and she is the one it cost. She was the only woman in this line who tried to speak, who wrote the letters and made the scenes and threatened to make it public, and she spent 40 years in exile for it, and her mother put her there. So when people say the Keppel women have always been like this, they are right, and they are right about entirely the wrong thing. What has been consistent across 125 years is the containment rather than the appetite. That was worth erasing, from the point of view of the people doing the erasing, because a woman who is merely scandalous is manageable, and a woman who is competent inside the machinery of state is a much more awkward object to have in an official biography. And it took 113 years, a burned archive, a tabloid circulation war, and a coronation on the anniversary of a death for any of it to come back. That is where I want to leave it. If this was worth 2.5 hours of your time, then do the thing that keeps it going. Subscribe if you have not. Leave a comment telling me what you make of the Violet question, because that is the one I have gone back and forth on for weeks, and I do not think there is a settled answer to it. And if there is a figure in this period you want done at this length and with this much digging, put the name down, and I will read every one of them. The letter is still missing. Whatever Alice Keppel carried into Buckingham Palace on the 6th of May 1910, and whatever the king had written in it, no archive holds it, and no historian has ever produced it. She spent the rest of her life making sure of that. Thank you for watching.